This module explains how to conduct basic due diligence in your supply chain. In some places, trade in minerals benefits dangerous armed groups. But legitimate businesses in these areas also depend on the minerals trade. Rather than avoid these areas altogether, smelters need to take precautions to ensure their suppliers and transactions don't support bad actors, wherever they operate. This is called due diligence. It's now a requirement of most customers. They expect you to show that your due diligence is effective and follows the accepted OECD guidance. Our responsible minerals assurance process helps you achieve this. To conform to OECD guidance, follow our due diligence process and verify it through audits. After a successful audit, you can be included in our list of conformance smelters, giving you access to the growing number of customers who expect it. The depth of the due diligence depends on where you operate or source from. All smelters need to conduct basic due diligence to ensure there are no red flags with any supplier or transaction. If there are red flags, like a supplier operating in a high-risk area, you'll also need to conduct enhanced due diligence. This module explains basic due diligence. Enhanced due diligence is covered in the following module. The key to due diligence is knowing your supplier and where your materials come from. So there are two aspects: know your counterparty and know your materials. In basic due diligence, your counterparty focuses on your direct supplier. Know your counterparty means clarifying who's involved in the supplier's business and who profits from the company. Let's say you have two suppliers for whom you haven't conducted Know Your Counterparty. One of them is an importer that you haven't worked with before. The other is a local supplier that you've worked with for years and know personally. For which of them must you conduct Know Your Counterparty? You need to conduct Know Your Counterparty for all suppliers, new or existing. Not knowing who you're dealing with could expose you to legal risks, like money laundering, tax evasion, or transactions benefiting armed groups. Know Your Counterparty is a standard process for a company to identify and verify the identity of its suppliers. You'll confirm that the company is operating legally and that none of its beneficial owners is under sanctions. To see how, check our Know Your Counterparty training module. Conduct Know Your Counterparty on all direct suppliers each year. Then, you need to conduct due diligence for each transaction to verify the source of the materials. We call this Know Your Materials. There are 4 parts to this process: identify materials, determine origin, review plausibility, and check for red flags. Include Know Your Materials in your procurement process for each transaction. First, you'll need to identify the material type, so you'll know if you need to determine its origin. At the smelter, a delivery of recycled materials has arrived from the supplier. A new employee receiving the shipment tells you the supplier hasn't provided a certificate of origin. What would you tell him to do? Recycled materials don't require you to determine the origin because they can no longer be traced back to a mine site. They only require a confirmation that the material is indeed recycled. Mined materials require origin determination unless they come from a conformance smelter. When you receive materials, sort them by type so you know if you need to determine the origin. Let's say a new supplier is sending a shipment of mined material. The supplier says it comes from a low-risk area. But when you ask for the country of origin certificate, she tells you this country doesn't provide them. What should you do? If the country of origin certificate is not available, define alternative documentation that could replace it. For example, export documentation, mine license, and purchase contract. Due diligence isn't about collecting specific paperwork. Instead, it means gathering enough data and documentation to ensure you have sufficient evidence to determine the origin. Start by gathering country of origin data. Usually, this is a government-issued country of origin certificate, but alternative documentation can be used instead. You also need to establish the location of the mine site. Usually, you'll need the mine license and purchase order or contract showing the mine name. If the material is artisanally mined, then you need to confirm the region of origin rather than the specific mine site. At this point, you have the data and documentation about your supplier and the origin of the materials. Before you accept an order, you need to review plausibility. This means reviewing the evidence to be confident about the origin and ensure there are no discrepancies or red flags. There are two types of plausibility to review: source plausibility and transaction plausibility. First, is it likely that the source can provide the amount of material the supplier is offering? To answer this, compare the supplier's offer with the available evidence, like geological studies. Check that the area produces enough of that type of material to confirm that the supplier's offer is reasonable. Let's say a supplier is offering you a 5-year contract to supply 100 tons per year from a new source. You're comparing import-export data for the mineral, and you realize the amount they're offering is most of the material that the geological studies say are available. What would you do? When there are discrepancies about the capacity, ask the supplier to give you their evidence. You need to be sure at least that the area can provide as much materials as they're offering. Keep in mind that the supplier may be selling material to other customers as well. Compare the supplier's evidence of capacity with what you know from production trends for the mineral, geological studies, and previous site visits. In this case, the new mine turns out to be the biggest in the area, so the source is plausible. For each transaction, check that the material you receive matches with the information you have about the material. Let's say the first shipment of mined material has arrived. When you compare assays of the shipment with assays from the sample, you find that the composition of the material is slightly different. You ask the supplier, and they admit that they'd mixed the original materials with materials from a different source. How should you respond? The supplier had mixed the materials without telling you. Giving you untrue information would be considered a potential red flag. To decide if a transaction is plausible, review the assays and material origin documentation. Then, compare this data with other information available to see if the materials could reasonably have come from the source the supplier says they came from. The plausibility review is complete when you're certain of the origin of the material and all discrepancies have been eliminated, or you've discovered a potential red flag. Finally, compare the information you have on the supplier and material origin with your red flag definitions. Make sure you consider the 5 red flags defined by the OECD. The area where the supplier says the materials came from or transited through is a high-risk area, or has limited known reserves of the material, or is a country where materials from high-risk countries are known to transit. The supplier or supplier's suppliers have a stake in a company that operates in or supplies material from a high-risk area, or have sourced materials from a high-risk area in the past year. For example, say there's an importer offering you a major new material source in a country you haven't sourced from before. You discover that the country is one that you consider to be a high-risk area. Does this trigger a red flag? Sources found in a high-risk area trigger a red flag, based on the OECD definitions. Now let's go back to that supplier who mixed other materials into the order without telling you. You don't have any evidence linking the material or supplier to a high-risk area, so it doesn't trigger any of the OECD's red flags. Should the supplier's actions trigger a red flag for you? A supplier providing deceptive information should trigger a red flag, even though it's not one of the OECD's red flags. That's why your policy should also include your own red flag definitions. Examples of what your own red flags could include are the supplier providing unreliable or deceptive information, or inability to determine origin. You've now found red flags with both suppliers. So, how do you respond? You have two choices. You could conduct enhanced due diligence, or you could decide not to use that source. Enhanced due diligence examines the whole supply chain back to the mine sites to identify and mitigate any risks. We encourage responsible sourcing from high-risk areas. It supports those communities and offers smelters greater sourcing opportunities. To see how, check out our module on enhanced due diligence. Let's take a moment to review. Basic due diligence has two aspects: know your counterparty and know your materials. Know your counterparty means clarifying who's involved in the supplier's business and who profits from the company. Conducting KYC is necessary for all suppliers, new or existing. Not knowing who you're dealing with could expose you to legal risks, like money laundering, tax evasion, or transactions benefiting armed groups. We explain KYC in detail in another module. Know your materials must be conducted with every transaction as part of your procurement process. Knowing your materials has four parts: identify materials, determine origin, review plausibility, and check for red flags. When you receive materials, sort them by type to identify whether or not you need to determine the origin. Determining materials' origin means gathering enough evidence to ensure that you know where they came from. This means you have to confirm the mine site, or region of origin for artisanal mining. The key data points to gather are country of origin and mine site or region of origin. Before you accept an order, you need to review the evidence to ensure that you can be confident about the origin and there are no discrepancies left unresolved. There are two types of plausibility to review: source plausibility and transaction plausibility. First, is it likely that the source can provide the amount of material the supplier is offering? Compare the supplier's evidence of capacity with what you know from production trends for the mineral, geological studies, and previous site visits. Then, for each transaction, check that the assays match with the material origin documentation. The plausibility review is complete when you're certain of the origin of the material and all discrepancies have been eliminated, or you've discovered a potential red flag. Finally, compare the information that you have on the supplier and material origin with your red flag criteria, the 5 OECD definitions plus your own. If you decide to get materials from a source that raised red flags, you'll need to conduct enhanced due diligence.